Kathryn Bertine, you are an author, an activist, a filmmaker, a public speaker, and a retired professional athlete. You have written 4 nonfiction books already, but today we are going to be speaking about your latest book, Stand, a memoir on activism, a manual for progress. What really happens when we stand on the front line of change. Kathryn, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
So, Kathryn, the first thing that I had to tell you is very frustrating to do a research on you because you have so many chapters in your life. I don't even know where to start. I mean, look at this intro. You write books. This is you have written 4 already. You are an activist, which is a topic of itself, and people can go really deep into that rabbit hole. But also a filmmaker and a professional speaker and a retired professional athlete. So um, let's just go back to, let's say you were in high school and you didn't know what to do with your life. What were you going to study? What was the place of sports in your life at that time?
Great question. Yeah, I wear a few hats on the tree of life, I suppose. And yeah, when I was younger, there were always 2 things that I think I identified most with, and that was being an athlete and being a writer. And back then in high school, I had an idea that my future would involve something in the publishing industry, and that I would have your typical standard quote unquote American dream life, which would be a house and a job and a family and 2.2 kids and a dog and a cat, right? Boy, did I take a U-turn somewhere along that path.
A detour.
Detour. I took a detour. That's the best way to say it. And it was a good detour in the sense that I think I stuck to my gut instinct of maybe that I needed to be on the road that, somehow I chose along the way. So, I had no idea back then when I was a kid that things like books and activism and filmmaking or nonprofit work, I didn't know that that would come into my life, but I can tell you that my roots of being a writer and an athlete spurred all of those other areas, and it was one that fed into the next that fed into the next.
I have made this correlation in the past with previous podcast guests who are also athletes or into sport. And I think there's some kind of parallel line between being an athlete and taking a role of leadership at a given moment in your life. Do you think that sports give people in general self-confidence to get things started, or at least not to back down from challenges?
I do. I think that, those of us who gravitate towards sports either have that desire to be a competitor, or they have a desire to just live a healthy existence, and those are 2 different paths, and they're both equally important. But I do think that those who maybe have that competitive edge really understand that connection with leadership, and maybe that's part of my journey too. I think for me, when I was getting into equality, there were things maybe that stemmed from my athletic background. For example, if you play any sport, there are rules in that sport, whether it's basketball or whatever it might be. I never played basketball, but just, here's how the game is played. Here are the rules that you subscribe to when you play, and I think for those of us maybe who then look at the world and they see, okay, here are the rules to play something. And if something is wrong with those rules, or maybe those rules are broken, then you speak up about that and say, hey, like when we see in sports, when we see fouls called,
Yeah.
Right? Somebody broke the rules. So maybe in some way that does correlate to athletes later in life, maybe feeling comfortable in speaking out for change, because certainly I saw rules being broken in what I think are rules that our world should should adhere to, and when those rules of equal opportunity and equality, or in this case, inequality, when those things started to surface, there must have been something within me that said, hey, we gotta call this out. We gotta step up. This isn't right. And I wouldn't be surprised if that came from the athletic side of my character, maybe.
And also as an athlete, first of all, when you are a beginner athlete in no matter which sport, you start by losing. I mean, you don't start running today and then win the race tomorrow. You start by losing. So you learn how to take defeat and then get up, assimilate that defeat and try again, and then get defeated again and then try it again. And that builds certain endurance and optimism as well, because you have to be optimistic enough to think, oh, maybe if I try yet one more time, if I just do a little bit more of hard work, if I play together with my team a little bit better, maybe we can win next time.
Yes, exactly that. It's so true that that just having that instinct of, when you first start something, of course you're nowhere near experienced. You either fall down, you lose, or you're slow, and that's normal in sport. That's where you start. And maybe it just comes down to somebody's disposition of, are they the kind of person who gets up and tries again and feels challenged in a healthy way by that? Or are they the type of personality who say, nope, I'm not into this, I'm out.
I'm a sore loser.
Right. Oh, that's a third category, like a sore loser. So there are so many different elements that being involved with sport will bring out in somebody. And I'm thankful that maybe my hardwiring led me down the trying to be a leader in some capacity path, but I had so many bumps and bruises along the way, and there were times too when I was like, oh, screw this, no more, I'm done, so I have that human element too. There's a lot of vulnerability in the book. You'll see that for sure.
So what was your first try into competitive sport?
So when I was a kid, growing up in the suburbs of New York City, I lived very close. I lived 5 minutes away from an ice rink. So I became a figure skater. I loved it. It was right there. It was easily accessible, great community. I loved it. Later in high school, I started running. I joined track and cross country. So I loved skating and running. My father was a rower, so he also got me into rowing. Later, when I rode through college, and when I went to graduate school out here in Tucson, Arizona, we don't have much ice or water out here. So I had a friend who said, get a bike, and I got into triathlon. And eventually within triathlon, I was strongest at cycling. So that's how I ended up in cycling. But when you trace back all of those sports, one is that I had accessibility to those sports because of where I live geographically. But one thing that was so different from cycling is that all of those sports, skating, rowing, running, triathlon, all of those sports to me were equal in the sense that, there were boys at the skating rink as well as little girls. There were boys and girls cross country and track leagues. Same thing with rowing. In triathlon, men and women ran the same distances, had the same access to courses, etc. So that to me, I didn't even realize that there was any sort of inequity in sport until I got to cycling, which I was very in love with the sport. But then it was like this giant curtain was, pulled back, and it revealed that cycling was nothing like all the other sports that I had played. And when I say this, I'm talking about bike racing and not, cycling around the neighborhood. That is pretty equal. We can all do that.
So can you highlight some of those inequities?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
To my eye, I mean, as someone who doesn't follow cycling, I just thought everyone had an equal chance or equal coverage. So what is not going on?
Well, that's very important, Elaine. I'm glad that you bring that up because you actually represent this loophole of, I call it the loophole of modernity. You are one of all of us who assume that, of course, it's 2020. Men and women should have equal access to anything, especially something as common as bike riding or bike racing. Why would it be any different, right? And that's where it's so shocking to people when I tell them that it is so completely backward in cycling. I'll give you some examples. For example, women have shorter races than men, deemed back in the day just simply because officials thought, oh, well, women could not possibly do the same distance as a man.
Back on the day, like last century, you're talking about?
Oh, let's say, for example, there are plenty of races out there. Let's say the men race 100 miles. They might only have an area where, or a category where women can race 50 or 75 miles, but not the 100. They're a woman. How could they possibly do that, right? I know, exactly. It's funny to think that's still out there.
But these rules are from these rules were created like 100 years ago, 200. How old are these rules?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and I'm going to get to that. But just to throw a couple of the inequities that are still on that list, not only do women not have the equal distance to a man, they also don't have equal opportunity to even get to some of these races. For example, the biggest one being the Tour de France. And I'll get to that. We fought for inclusion there, and we do have inclusion, but it's still not the equal number of days as the men. And then at the professional level, the races that we do have access to, we women, we do not receive the same prize purse as the men. So that's the big trifecta of it. And now to go back to answer your question, why is it like that? Where do these rules come from? Well, if you happen to follow any sport, you'll know that every sport out there has a governing body. You know, we have the NFL for football, the MLB for Major League Baseball, etc. You know, every sport out there. In cycling, we have the UCI, which stands for Union Cycliste Internationale. And that is the governing body for all of professional cycling. The UCI has been around for 120 years. Wow. And in those, yes, it's been around since really pretty much it formed in, 1900, I believe. And since then, I love telling people these stats. There have been 11 presidents in 120 years. You can imagine how long some of those terms have been, right?
So every time someone died, that's when they get a new president.
It's almost like a dictatorship or some sort of, it's back in the day. Yeah, there were presidents that lasted as long as 24 years simply because they went unchallenged or they just kept serving over and over again. Yeah. And within those 11 presidents, they have all been white European middle-aged men.
As almost everywhere else in society.
Yeah, you're right. This is not specific to cycling. You're absolutely right. So, it does start to instill that notion of traditionalism. And it's no question that some of these rules that were passed back in the, let's say the 1950s, for example, they've just stuck around for another 60 or 70 years because they have not yet been challenged or adapted in any way. So, for example, back in the 1950s, I believe it was 55, and I write about this in Stand, there was a women's field introduced at the Tour de France. And it was well received by the public. The public loved it. But back then, it was introduced almost as a stunt, like, oh yeah, let's see if the women can do it, and it was prodded at, almost like a jester type of event. But then when the women did great and the public loved it, they didn't continue the event, which is interesting, right? Then it came back in the 80s for 4 years. You can imagine 30 years later, from the 50s to the 80s, now women's cycling is better and faster and stronger. It's been around a longer time. And the fans loved it, especially at the Tour de France, where fans will climb into the mountains to watch the peloton roll by. Now they got to see two races, the men and the women. They loved it. When you're a fan of a sport, if you're watching men or women at the top of their game, you don't care. It's just great either way. But after 4 years of running the Tour de France, in 1989, the Tour de France, this is about the time when things were being televised internationally and TV and media rights were being sold. And the directors of the Tour de France sold the TV rights to cover the men's event. And instead of including the women in TV coverage, they completely scrapped the women's race. And there were some forward thinkers, and they thought, you know what, we'll do our own Tour de France. We will go ahead and start a women's field and make our own Tour de France. And ASO, the owners of the Tour de France, prohibited the women from using the name Tour de France. They said, you may not have this, we own this name. So they essentially blocked the women. A few very creative and hopeful businesses and people got together to say, well, we'll call it something else. And I believe they called it like the Grand Boucle and other names, but it didn't stick because it was having a harder time attracting sponsors. They didn't get to use the name Tour de France, right? So this is what was going on for a very long time. And I know I'm going to get back so you can actually ask me more questions rather than me babbling on.
No, but this is great because, this inequality is not, I guess it's not. I remember seeing a video of the Boston Marathon, and a woman had to disguise herself as a man in order to participate. And whenever she, I don't know, let her hair loose, and it was obvious it was a female, the officials by force tried to take her out of the competition. So this seclusion, this prevention from women to participate in sports is just, I guess it's rampant now that I'm talking to you now. All these images are coming to my mind of all these other sports where this is happening.
You're right. The instance you described was Kathryn Switzer in the 1967 Boston Marathon, and she's very relevant to our book Stand. I'm fortunate now to call her a friend and a contact. She's been so helpful in my fight for women's equality and equal opportunity at the Tour de France. So she's wonderful. And that story of, back in the day of the race director physically trying to remove her from the race, 1967, that's 50 years ago, right? Look how good my math skills are, right? But to think that this is still happening today, right, is a big deal. It's a big deal that, now, however, when we turn on the TV or we watch the Olympics or we watch marathon, it's so normal that we see, of course, there is a women's field included. And we certainly, many of us know that tennis had this same struggle back in the 70s. But can you imagine now not having Venus and Serena and all of their all of the entire generation that they have created?
I think they bring as much money and sponsors and spectators as the men tennis.
Exactly. No? That's exactly it. People want to watch the sport played at its best level. And when women and men are at their highest level, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. It makes for an incredibly exciting sports match. So same thing in cycling as well. But still to this day, we have to deal with these stereotypes where these antiquated thinkers believe we're pedaling around in our petticoats and bonnets, and how could we possibly be very interesting to watch? We're very slow, and that's not the case at all.
But getting the example from other sports and knowing that you have a public, there is an interest from the public, and sponsors, once they see that there is an interest, sponsors are happy to, I don't know, give some money to sponsor the events. Why wouldn't they want to make some extra cash on something that is already set up?
Great question. We often have a lot of people that will provide this very outdated excuse where they say, oh, well, show us or prove to us that putting the women in the spotlight will be worth it. They'll take that line of, or they'll say there's no money in publicizing the women's side, to which we all appropriately respond, give us the opportunity to showcase the women and the money will follow. If you think about where all of this happens, the change has to come from the top down. And until we have equal access and equal opportunity to the race, we simply cannot showcase our talents if we don't have the availability to do that, right? So one of the big areas, we talk a lot about how sponsorship and media, sponsorship and media coverage go hand in hand, right? So how do we get that media coverage? Well, we have to be first granted equal opportunity to compete at these races. So,
didn't to skip, I mean, I don't know much about cycling, so that's why I venture into other subjects.
Yeah.
But as I recall, the female soccer team had bigger audience and higher ratings than the male soccer team for the United States, yet they get only half of the pay as their losers compatriot or the losers teammate, a male. Yeah. So I just don't understand it.
Well, you bring up a great point, and I think what's so important is that you don't have to be a sports fan to appreciate that, epic discrepancy or that epic pay gap that's happening. And I think that finally people are paying attention to this, and we need to pay attention to it in all regard. And certainly that's what I'm hoping about the book Stand. You don't have to be a cycling fan or have any interest in cycling to appreciate and recognize when stuff is not going correctly, and
Right.
when things are unequal. It's not about cycling, it's about our society being broken. And if it's broken in this part, is it also broken over here, over here, over here? And we're finding now that that's really the issue that needs to be tackled, is that this isn't just happening to women's soccer or women's cycling. For example, did you know that the majority of female doctors are paid less than their male counterparts? Why
Well,
is that? Right? And it's true.
yeah, I know that because I do research all the time, but it's actually unknown. And I guess the life that they save is not as worth as much as the life that the male doctor save. Who knows?
Exactly. And I think that's where one of the things where we can all help shift this paradigm is by calling that out. So, say you have zero interest in cycling, but you're very, very passionate about, the field of medicine, for example, to do some research there and say, well, what's going on here? Are women and men being paid or treated equally, to equal opportunity? And see what you can dig up in your specific area. This often happens in education as well. There are some school systems where men and women are paid equally, and you can actually track their salaries in public settings, but not all school systems subscribe to that. So there are teachers that are being paid unequally, where a man and a woman can hold the same rank, same degree, same years that they've put in, and the men make more than the women. So I think what I would say is, for everybody, whatever you're passionate about, whether it's cycling, education, doctors, or look, maybe your favorite hobby in the world is knitting. Well, then do some research there and find out, what about the knitting world? Is there a discrepancy? I think it's interesting, and hopefully we can find in this modern day and age, maybe there are some areas where men and women are treated equally and being paid equally. But it's really important for all of us to call out, to first uncover that discrepancy and call out where it's happening, and then affect change in those areas, because that's your area of passion. And I know that we can all do this, because if I've been able to effect change and make things happen, and I'm neither a celebrity nor wealthy nor an Olympic gold medalist, if I was able to infiltrate the Tour de France and make change happen, and I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm a dual citizen of the Caribbean, then if I can make that change, anybody can. And I hope that message gets out there.
what do you know about, as far as I know, there are some forward-looking countries like the Nordic countries who apparently they have more of an equal footing. Do you know how much is that true and how much is that good public relations?
Oh, you bring up a great question, and I have to be careful because I only have a limited knowledge, but I do know I have looked into Norway and Sweden and Finland and some of these, Scandinavian countries that they seem to get it.
Mhm.
They happen to be a lot more forward than we are by they have knocked down that gender barrier along the way. That we North Americans and, well, the rest of the world haven't quite gotten around to yet. So, it's worth it. It's such an interesting thing to search on Google, like what country has the most equality for women?
Right.
And then you can, say, is it pay equity? Is it equal opportunity? What realm of equity are we talking about? It's really interesting. There are countries out there doing it right, but I should stop there because I wish I had all the stats on hand.
Okay, so let me ask you about something that you are an expert. What was the turning point where you said, okay, I have to write a book about this? I cannot keep quiet about this issue any longer. I had to sit down and start typing all this information that needs to get out.
Oh, what a great question. I think that moment came for me when it was around 2014 and 2015. And I talk about this in the book, so I'm okay with getting a little bit personal on this level. In 2014, I was racing for a world tour team in cycling. And at the world tour level, which is the highest you can get at the professional ranks, there is a minimum base salary for the men. And back in 2014, there was not a minimum base salary for the women. So we were being paid very, very, very small wages, not livable. And many of us, myself included, had to work 2 or more, sometimes part-time jobs on top of racing professionally, right? And the men made a minimum base salary back then of 35,000 euro. And many made a lot more than that, but at least you knew if you hit that level, you would at least receive that, right? And that was not the case. So I worked 2 part-time jobs in addition to racing professionally, and I was barely squeaking by. I was married at the time, and I went through a really unexpected and difficult divorce. And as I struggled my way through that period, I thought to myself, well, shit, if I had been a man, I would have had a salary in place. And because I am a woman at the same level of sport, the same ability, and I don't have that base salary, I am now struggling to get by, but I'm probably going to have to quit this sport just to make ends meet. And to quit a sport when you're at your peak and you're at your highest, it's one thing to quit a sport and retire because you've had your run and you're no longer as proficient as you once were. That's a very healthy reason to retire from a sport. But to have to exit a sport when you're at your prime because you can't make it, that's not okay. And because you're a woman not receiving. So that's where it really hit me, where as I was struggling and finding my way through for those 2 years, I remember thinking, well, gosh, what if there were a way that we could change this system, that we could fight for base equity, base pay equity for women, and what if in the meantime there were an actual place where women could go and train and live for free if they're struggling with that gender pay gap, while they're also racing and being a pro athlete. I wanted both to exist, fight the system, but help those who are still struggling. So that's when I thought to myself, I think I need to write about this journey. But at that point, I was still stuck in the journey itself. And I thought, okay, and I kind of filed it away. And that's when I started the course of activism for what would eventually become Homestretch Foundation, which is a foundation where women who struggle with the pay gap in professional sports can come and live for free and base themselves here while they go and they do their sport. But I also knew at that point, that, okay, I'll get to this book, but it can't be now. I first have to finish my racing career. I have to set up this Homestretch Foundation, and then maybe it'll be at the point where I can sit down and start writing. So that's kind of what flipped the switch for me. And then, you know, a couple years later in 2017, I retired from racing professionally on a very positive note. I'm like, I'm good. I've done what I wanted to do. I'm ready to move forward. And that's when I said, okay, I am going to start writing about this journey. And I also felt that at that point I could reflect on some of the personal stuff as well as the professional side of activism. And that was when I started. What's wonderfully ironic is the fact that, you know, this book, Stand, it's my 4th book. And I thought to myself, this is great. I've already had 3 books come out. I can go, my agent can go back to these publishers and say, hey, she's working on her 4th book. Which of you would like this? Who wants it? We crossed our fingers hoping, okay.
Who's going to give more?
Yeah, you know, you think you're stepping up this trajectory in your career. You're getting a little bit better each time. And we thought, oh yeah, the publishers will like this book. And of course, as we all know, especially in North America, watching our political system unfold over the past few years, you know, issues like women and inequity and inequality, that was a big deal. And we thought for sure, if anyone's paying attention to our political and social climate, this is the right time to have a book about women who stand up and speak out and fight for change. Like, this is perfect timing. Instead, the exact opposite happened. All of the corporate publishing industries turned down the book proposal for Stand.
Wow.
They all turned it down, citing, wait a minute, a book about women who stand up and fight for equal opportunity, that won't sell. And my agent and I were like, well, what do you mean? And they're like, well, we can't find other books out there. Or they would say things like, well, Kathryn's not famous. You know, she's not like an Instagram celebrity. She's not wealthy. She doesn't have, you know, a gazillion thousand followers. So no, we're not going to take a chance on this book. So they were trying to kind of articulate that change can only happen by only famous people can make change happen, or only famous people are worth investing in. You know, and that's, oh boy, you know, so for over a year, my agent and I went through these constant turning down, rejecting this book proposal, and with all the publishers saying the same thing. And it got to that point. In the beginning, I was a little bit, I was sad, and I was like, really? No one's going to take a chance on this? And that it hurt my feelings.
Of course.
Right?
Especially because you have proven yourself already.
Thank you.
Have built a reputation. You have 3 books, and you have a following. I consider that you have a decent following.
Thank you.
It's just so, and not only that, you already produced a film. You participated as a pro athlete in so many competitions. It's just backwards.
It is. It was backward thinking, and I appreciate your you know, plug of support with that. You know, and when these traditional publishers didn't take that line of view, they, you know, it really finally kind of flipped the switch for me, where I said, fine, if they're not going to publish this, I'll do it myself. I will create a self-published label and I'll put it out. Oh my gosh, I didn't know how much work that would be, but but that's where we are now, and that's the choice that I've gone, and the path that I've taken, and that choice has kind of made me think, you know what? Let's prove these publishers wrong.
Right.
And that's where my competitive sport nature kicks into play, right?
Perfect. Yes.
That's where it's like, oh no, you think that a book about women fighting for change, you don't think that's going to sell? Oh yeah? Watch me. And this is where I'm crossing my fingers and just hoping that some people out there in the public will agree with that message and they'll stand behind Stand.
Wow. I'm going to take you back to 2013, when your manager asked you to stop talking about this inequality crap. What was going on then, and how do you take that?
Great question. Yeah. So in 2013, at this point, this was my 2nd year of racing at the professional level. And the first year was great. The 2nd year, I had a manager for the team that I was on, and it was a woman too, which is really interesting. She did not like it at all that I was constantly challenging the UCI or ASO, the Tour de France owners, or the governing body of cycling, you know, about these problems, these inequities. In her eyes, she felt that that sponsors would step away from our team because I was speaking out, or that, you know, I was being a rabble rouser. And, you know, she was of the mindset that I should smile and wave and ride my bike and look pretty and just say positive things about cycling.
I'm surprised she didn't ask you to wear high heels while biking.
Right. And sequins and a dress and like perfectly coiled hair beneath my helmet. Yeah, exactly. It was such an old school mentality that she had. She was only a few years older than me. So you know, that was equally odd for me, but that was her way of thinking, that this, you know, stick to the plan. And I would have loved, it would have been great if women were treated equally. I would have smiled and waved and, you know, done those things, but women weren't being treated equally in the sport. So I couldn't put that fake face on. And I think she also knew how much I loved the sport, because you learn fast as an activist. If you're just sitting around bitching and complaining, yeah, nobody's going to listen to that. You have to be as proactive in offering solutions and really truly showcasing your love of, in this case, the sport that I was so passionate about, you know. So it was very obvious how much I loved cycling, how much I loved our team, how much I loved racing, but yet I'm still gonna, you know, poke the bear, so to speak, and make change happen. But she didn't like it. And she actually said to me, this was early on in the 2013 season, she said, I need you to stop talking about all this equality nonsense, this, you know, stop talking. And if you don't, I won't race you. Wow. And yeah, unfortunately, true to her word, I raced one race in 2013 with the team, and she benched me for the rest of the season. Wow. And that was heartbreaking for me. This also happened. What's important to know too is this was in 2013. Our film that we made on women's pro cycling, called Half the Road, you know, the passion and power of, and the pitfalls of women's pro cycling, that came out in 2014. But during 2013, I was making this film. So I don't think that director really, nor anybody else, had any idea what the film would truly encompass. I met resistance where a lot of people thought that maybe I was making a vanity film, you know, something about myself. And I kept telling them, no, it's not about me. There are times when I'm in it, but it's about everybody else. It's about the sport, the amazing women that we interview, amazing people. There are amazing men we interview in this film. But of course, the director and others had not seen the film at that point. So they just kind of had these preconceived notions. And that was very hard. I write about that in Stand too, being misunderstood, or your vision isn't fully grasped, even if your intentions are in the right place. So 2013 was really hard because I did kind of have to smile and put on this face of like, I made it to the pro ranks. I am a pro cyclist, but behind the scenes, I was benched from my race.
Okay, so from talking to you, I get the sense you have a lot of courage and determination, and you have started all these movements. And maybe many of us are not as courageous, but we would like to stand anyways and contribute. Like I send you a few photos of mine. I'm not as courageous as you, but I go and stand in protest and put my. So how can a regular Joe Blow individual who doesn't have your courage, how can they still be an activist?
That's such a great question. I'm so glad that you asked that. There are a few ways that I think are so helpful. For those who are out there on the front lines of activism, to have people stand behind them in terms of support and share what that person and or people, you know, I talk about this too. It wasn't just me. I created a team to help move these progressive things forward. So on social media, how important it is. If you're not comfortable being on the front lines, you don't have to, but maybe you could retweet or share any of the links that are coming up that your social activism, heroes, that whatever people that you admire, what they're doing, share it. Not just on social media, talk about it with others, with friends, with family. Hey, did you know that this inequity exists? Well, here's what I'm following. Here's what's happening. These are amazing ways that create huge, huge, huge ripple effects, right? Talk to people, share it on social media. If you are so moved, you can do some research. Again, this doesn't mean you have to be in the limelight, but you can do some research and you can write to members of your political affiliation and say, hey, would you consider sponsoring this bill? Or what are you doing? Did you know that this inequity exists? What are you doing to fight this? You can actually write letters of support. You could even schedule meetings. There are so many politicians out there that don't even know about these various inequities that happen. And you can be that bridge without having to have that direct, necessarily face-to-face contact that an on the field or on the ground person might. But what an amazing part. If you are able to financially contribute to any of these movements, please do so. I can give an example. Our film, Half the Road, when we made this, I was working for ESPN at the time. ESPN turned it down for the same reasons. They're like, oh, a film on women's cycling, it's just, no one's gonna watch it. And I did the same thing that I've always done. Oh yeah? Let's prove you wrong, So we made Half the Road independently, and we financed this film through crowdsourcing. This was back, the crowdsourcing was happening during 2012 and 2013. And we not only hit our budget, but we went over our budget because the public contributed. And I'm talking about donations that came in between $5 or $10,000. And that's a huge realm. Right? But what I love about that was that people who were able to make contributions to this film on activism, they did. And it ended up being 16 different countries and 600 people that funded our film. So I think that's a wonderful way to help. And again, I want to put that out there that so many people think that helping involves writing 3 or 4 or 5 six-figure checks. And what I would love to remind people is that even your $10 contribution to a project that you believe in can go such a long way. Right. So if you're able, that's great. But also it's not all, like we've talked about, it's not all about financial side. It's about sharing and speaking and standing. And let me tell you something, the media pays close attention to things that are happening on social media platforms. So if you're in that world, and you share things, it's not just about getting one share, it's about how many shares that share gets. And it can truly create an amazing ripple effect. So don't be afraid to try those methods. So I hope those are some ideas. Those are some of the many ideas.
I'm not as courageous as you, but the way that I'm showing my activism is just by show my body whenever there's a protest, just show up there and be present and encourage the people who are protesting. It's in particular, I have gone to 2 racial inequality protests, which is huge. But another thing that I'm doing is no longer stay quiet. So, there's a lot of jokes about either among men about women. There's a lot of sexism going on, and then about racial nicknames, and I decided no longer stay quiet. Like one time in the past, I would just say nothing, and I would do a very uncomfortable smile. But now I say, no, hey, listen, this is not right. This is a person. This is not whatever derogative name you call this, or this is a woman. She's not there to please you. She's so those are the things that so far I have the courage to stand up and do those things, and maybe one day I'll be more courageous like you.
Oh, I think you are plenty courageous doing that. It takes a lot to call somebody out on that, I think it's great. One of the terms that I've been using in calling that out is I'll say to people, like, if they use one of those derogatory terms that have been around for generations, sometimes a really quick, easy way to do it is say, hey man, times have changed. I don't know if that's the right term to be using anymore. You
Right.
know,
Okay.
and that's helped me, where it kind of feels like, I don't know, it's a quick thing of being like, hey, that might have worked in the past, but times have changed. You know, you got to be careful. I wouldn't be using that term anymore. It's, you know, and then whatever it might be, sexist, racist, etc. And it might help open that person's eyes to, in fact, yes, times have changed and you are stuck in the past a bit, you know?
Yeah.
But I love that.
The other day, a friend of mine and I, we were talking about whether or not politically correctness has gone too far. And then I said, well, you know, I don't want the times in which a guy in a restaurant could just slap the waitress in her butt and say, hey, dear, do this for me. You know, those times are way gone. We had to treat people with respect.
Agreed. Those times are gone for sure. And you are such an important part in this cog of the wheel of progress. If all of us do that and we call it out, then you are an activist. You know, you really are. And that needs to carry important weight, because if people weren't doing that, then I would have a lot less of a platform to stand upon and feel strong to move forward. But every voice that rises up, and I know we're in this weird time right now of a pandemic where not everybody's going to feel comfortable going out to an event and showing up. I get that. But for those, you know, and hopefully those days are soon coming when we can do that again. But whether you do or you don't, you know, in the meantime, you can stand, you know, do your comfort level in terms of standing in person, but maybe challenge yourself when this pandemic is in a different place and it's comfortable to go outside to events. You know, I have to tell you, you got to try it, because it's amazing the energy that you get being around other people, like-minded people who want to see this change happen. Isn't it quite a rush?
It is quite amazing. Okay, I have two questions to close it off. So right now you started this Homestretch Foundation. Can you tell the listeners how they can help out?
Oh, sure. So homestretchfoundation.org. That's our website. You can head over there and read a little bit about it. We currently, our residence is in Tucson, Arizona, where a lot of pro cyclists will come to train during the winter months. And what we do is we take in 6 to 8 athletes on a normal year. This year we're taking in fewer due to COVID situations, but we take in 6 to 8 athletes who are already at the professional level, and they are allowed to live and train here for free. So the donations that we get help us cover the carrying costs of this house/compound, so that these women can live for free. We love being very transparent about that, you know, that every dollar that comes in goes to paying your typical household bills. So none of our athletes ever have to do that. Yeah, it's great. It's working. We are now in our 5th year. And so far we have helped 70 athletes from 17 different countries. You know, and many of our athletes, knock on wood, that the Olympics happen this coming year, they will be there. And it's, you know, so that is, it makes me happy, and I hope it gives other people that happiness too. So please head on over to homestretchfoundation.org to learn more.
There will be links on the show notes. Okay, and my last question, can you tell us one more time the name of the book? The title, the subtitle is very long.
It is a long subtitle.
Okay, and then where can people find it?
Okay, great. Stand, a memoir on activism, a manual for progress. What really happens when we stand on the front lines of change. And so the book is coming out February 1st. You can pre-order it now. I will give you 2 ways to do that. If you're in the US, we like to send people to Barnes & Noble. They can order it in many ways. You can order it online at barnesandnoble.com, or you can go to or call your local Barnes & Noble and give them my name and the book title, if you tell them Kathryn Bertine stand, they'll find it in the system.
Right, right.
And then for all of my dear friends in Canada and the rest of the world, you can find easily by typing Kathryn Bertine stand into your Amazon browser.
Right.
And it will pop up there. Right now, there is an ebook and a hardcover available for pre-sale. And in February, a paperback will also be added to the list, but choose your form of reading, and it helps support us all the way. So those links are out there now. You can get a little bit more info too. If you head on over to kathrynbertine.com, you can join my mailing list where I send out updates. Very few, but I will send out update when the book drops in stores, and we'll keep you posted. But I am not a fan of spam. You'll never get spam. And I also send out very few mailings because I simply don't have time for for that. So I promise not to flood your inbox in any way.
Right. And just for information of the listeners, anytime you go to a local library and you say, hey, I would like to have this book here, they are more than happy to go and order that book for you. If they just need to know from their clientele which books to buy, because many times they are just going blind by whatever they see in the newspaper. But if regular Joe and Blow goes there and say, hey, maybe you should have this book in your library, they will do it because that's what they want to do. They want to know what the customer wants. So you have to tell them, and they will follow through. Kathryn, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation. And good luck with all your projects. I'm going to sign up for your mailing list as well. And on to soon.
Elaine, thank you so much. I have absolutely loved this podcast. You're a terrific host. Thank you so much. And thank you to all your listeners.